On November 29th of 1859, Jesse Harding Pomeroy was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, to Thomas J. Pomeroy and Ruth Ann Snowman. While Jesse was just a baby, his father enlisted in the Union Army and marched southward to put down the slave traders of the Confederacy. It was a noble pursuit, but it left young Jesse without a father figure during his crucial formative years, and when his father did finally return, he was but a shadow of his former self. Thomas Pomeroy had no interest in raising his two boys. He returned from the war with little passion for anything but chronic alcoholism, and although Ruth Ann tried her best, she was unable to keep young Jesse's behavior from degenerating into savagery. Around the time of Jesse's 13th birthday, several neighborhood children spoke of being lured to a secluded area by a slightly older boy. Once alone, the boy would begin to savagely beat them with a leather belt, and on one occasion, a young girl had her face carved up with a knife. The local constabulary conducted an investigation, but sadly, no viable suspects were identified and the attacker was unpunished. Ruth Ann Pomeroy was terrified that her two darling boys would suffer a similar fate and berated her drunkard of a husband for his callous indifference. In the end, she left him, moving to South Boston with her two boys in order to protect them from danger. Yet to her horror, the attacks in the old neighborhood seemed to cease from the moment they moved, and instead recommenced around their new South Boston home. Local children became terrified, and their fearful parents kept them off the streets after sundown. Yet to his mother's grim curiosity, young Jesse never once seemed afraid that he might be targeted, and came up with a variety of bizarre excuses as to why he should be allowed to roam the streets at night. After weeks of being unable to prevent her son from his late-night prowling, and with the number of victims mounting, the truth became evident for all to see. Little Jesse Pomeroy was the boy responsible for the string of violent beatings, and he was arrested by a pair of Boston police officers. Jesse was originally sentenced to 4 years at the State Reform School for Boys at Westborough, Massachusetts. However, after just a year in confinement, he was determined to be mentally deficient and was released back into the care of his mother in February of 1874. By that point, Jesse's mother ran her own dressmaking shop and was generating a respectable income for a single mother in the late 19th century. His brothers supplemented the household income by selling newspapers and planned to learn a trade once an apprenticeship opened up. In short, Jesse had everything to look forward to in a family who were prepared to love and support him following his release. He could have done almost anything, pursued almost any passion or vocation, yet Jesse chose the only thing he ever really wanted in life: inflicting pain and suffering on those weaker and smaller than him. During March of 1874, 10-year-old Katie Curran went missing from the streets surrounding her childhood home. Jesse's mother begged her son to assure her of his innocence, and the boy swore on his eyes that he had changed his ways. As the days went by, Ruth Ann began to detect the scent of something rotten in the basement of her dress shop. She didn't object when a brace of police officers darkened her door. She simply directed them towards the basement and offered up the location of her bloodthirsty son. The young Miss Curran had been hastily concealed in an ash heap and had been horrifically mutilated both before and after her death. Chunks of her thigh were missing, with clear bite marks surrounding the indentations. Her eyes had been removed, replaced with small pebbles and dirt, and a great deal more had been stuffed down her throat. Sections of her skin had been sliced and peeled away as if her killer had performed some kind of amateur dissection, exploring the flesh which lay beneath. It's said that the police officers who caught young Jesse that day dragged him back to his mother's dress shop to make him look at what he'd done. One officer sought to confirm his guilt by outright asking the boy if he'd murdered little Katie Curran. Jesse said nothing. He just looked up at the officer and smiled. The case of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Pomeroy was heard in the state's Supreme Judicial Court on December 9th and 10th of 1874. Jesse was pronounced guilty, but with the jury's recommendation of mercy on account of his young age. Given the extremely brutal nature of the crime, this request for leniency was completely disregarded by the presiding judge, who assured Jesse that he'd burn in hell before sentencing him to be hanged. Pomeroy's attorney, Charles Robinson, filed 2 exceptions which were overruled in February 1875, at which point Pomeroy was sentenced to death by hanging. But then, In a highly controversial ruling, the governor of Massachusetts refused to comply with his own executive responsibility. After that, he not once but twice refused to comply with the rulings of the Massachusetts Governor's Council, and furthermore refused to resign, even when threatened with removal from office. The confrontation made for one of the most intensely controversial political ordeals of its time, and almost every American in the country became aware of the complete breakdown of civil governance up in Boston. Then finally, in August of 1876, the council took a third vote, anonymously this time, and Jesse's sentence was commuted to life in prison and solitary confinement. He was 16 years and 9 months old, and had been condemned to spend what remained of his life almost completely alone. As the years went by, Jesse was interviewed in his prison cell by a journalist from the fledgling Boston Globe. He claimed to have taught himself several foreign languages, including Hebrew, and stunned one visiting German-born psychiatrist who found that he had learned German with considerable accuracy. This suggests that Jesse was in possession of a sinister kind of intelligence, one that could have enabled him to remain undetected for so long. Jesse wrote poetry, studied law, and spent decades composing legal challenges to his conviction. A 1914 psychiatric report noted that Jesse had made between 10 and 12 determined attempts to escape, and that he'd lost an eye attempting to destroy a wall of his cell by redirecting a gas pipe. The same report asserts that Jesse had shown the greatest ingenuity and a persistence which is unprecedented in the history of the prison. As a result, Jesse's sentence was commuted from permanent solitary confinement to life imprisonment among the general prison population. Jesse partook in regular prison life for around 12 years, but by 1929, he was an elderly man in frail health. He was eventually transferred to the Bridgewater Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he died on September 29, 1932. His death marked the end of an old and sickly man, still suffering due to the crimes of his youth. Perhaps it's unjust to punish a man for the crimes of his youth, and this is why juvenile murderers sometimes see only a decade inside of prison. But perhaps there are some who are born with an urge to kill, one that will never be beaten or conditioned out of them, no matter how hard society tries. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.